In the summer of 1922, a clandestine operation began that would fundamentally alter the American public's understanding of the Ku Klux Klan's inner workings. While historians often focus on the Klan's public spectacles, their marches through city streets, their burning crosses on hillsides, their political rallies that drew thousands, the organization's true power resided in shadows, in midnight meetings where violence was planned with bureaucratic precision, where terror campaigns were coordinated across state lines, and where a network of sympathizers in law enforcement and government systematically protected Klan operatives from prosecution. This is the story of how that veil of secrecy was pierced, not by federal agents or crusading journalists, but by a group of black veterans, churchwomen, and community organizers who risked everything to document the undocumented, to photograph the unphotographable, and to bring to light what the Klan believed would forever remain hidden. Their mission would span 3 years, cross 7 states, and ultimately provide the evidence that would begin dismantling the Second Klan's infrastructure of terror. This documentary explores that secret mission, the extraordinary individuals who carried it out, and the intelligence network they built to expose America's most dangerous domestic terrorist organization at the height of its power. The idea originated not in a moment of inspiration, but in accumulated frustration. Reverend Marcus Tillman had buried 17 members of his Pittsburgh congregation between 1920 and 1922, all victims of racial violence that local police classified as altercations or disputes gone wrong, never as lynchings, never as Klan activity. Tillman kept meticulous records in a leather journal he carried everywhere. Names, dates, circumstances of death, names of witnesses who later recanted their testimony, names of police officers who declined to investigate. On a humid evening in June 1922, sitting in the basement of Bethlehem Church, he spread those records across a table before a gathering of 23 people who had traveled from 6 different cities. "We document our dead," he said, his voice steady despite the rage underneath. "But we never document our killers. They operate in darkness because we let darkness be enough." The room fell silent. Everyone present had lost someone, a brother, a sister, a child, a parent to Klan. Violence that was never officially acknowledged as such. Among those gathered was Adelaide Brooks, whose husband had been murdered outside a polling place in Mobile, Alabama, 6 months after returning from France, where he'd served with distinction in the 369th Infantry Regiment. The coroner ruled it a heart attack, despite the rope burns on his neck. Adelaide had been a schoolteacher before that day, but grief had transformed her into something else entirely, a woman with nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. She had taught herself photography using equipment her husband bought before the war, developing plates in a makeshift darkroom she constructed in her kitchen. She understood what Reverend Tillman was proposing before he finished speaking. "You want evidence," she said, not as a question. "Not testimony that can be dismissed or witnesses who can be intimidated. You want photographs, documents, recordings. You want proof that cannot be denied." Tillman nodded slowly. "I want to build a case so comprehensive that even sympathetic judges cannot ignore it. I want to document their organization the way anthropologists document a society. Structure, hierarchy, financing, operations." The scope of what Tillman envisioned was staggering, and several people argued impossible. The Klan in 1922 was not the scattered remnant of Reconstruction's end, but a sophisticated national organization claiming over 4 million members, operating openly in many communities, with chapters in city governments, police departments, and state legislatures. They held picnics that drew thousands, published newspapers distributed across the country, and operated with an air of invincibility, born from decades of impunity. To infiltrate such an organization, to document its inner workings, required resources this group did not have, skills they would need to learn, and a level of coordination that seemed impossible given the distances involved. But one person in that basement room possessed something crucial, connections to people who might make the impossible merely extraordinarily dangerous. Samuel Washington had served as a liaison officer between black units and white command during the Great War, a position that required him to navigate between worlds, to understand how information flowed through military bureaucracies, and to identify who held real power versus who held official rank. We need three things, he said, his military bearing evident in his posture: intelligence-gathering methods, secure communications, and financial backing. I know where we can find all three. Washington's primary contact was Jonathan Reeves, a white former Army intelligence officer who had spent 18 months in France working with Washington on counter-espionage operations against German infiltrators. Reeves had returned to civilian life, disillusioned with America's treatment of black veterans and troubled by the Klan's growing influence in his native Indiana. He worked as a private investigator in Indianapolis, occasionally taking cases that brought him into contact with Klan members who assumed his whiteness meant shared sympathies. When Washington traveled to Indianapolis to present Tillman's proposal, Reeves listened for 3 hours without interrupting, taking notes in the same shorthand he'd used during the war. "Everything you're describing is feasible," Reeves finally said, but it requires compartmentalization. The people gathering intelligence cannot know everyone else doing the same work. Communications must be coded and routed through intermediaries. Evidence must be duplicated and stored in multiple secure locations. One person getting caught cannot compromise the entire operation. His clinical assessment of the dangers made the mission feel both more real and more terrifying. Reeves outlined an intelligence framework adapted from military counter-espionage methods. They would need field operatives, people who could attend Klan meetings, either as members or in capacities that gave them access to Klan spaces. They would need technical operators, photographers, stenographers, people who could document what field operatives observed. They would need analysts, individuals who could examine collected intelligence, identify patterns, trace financial flows, and map organizational structures. They would need couriers, people who could transport materials between cities without drawing attention. And they would need what Reeves called ghosts, operatives whose connection to the mission remained unknown to everyone except their single point of contact. People who could continue operating even if the main network was discovered. "The Klan believes in white supremacy," Reeves said, his mouth twisting with disgust, "which means they cannot imagine sophisticated resistance from black Americans. That arrogance is your greatest advantage. They will never suspect they're being systematically documented until it's too late." Building this network required months of careful recruitment and training. Adelaide Brooks became the mission's chief technical operator, teaching a select group of women advanced photography techniques, including how to take pictures in low light, how to photograph documents quickly without being noticed, how to develop plates under improvised conditions, and how to conceal photographic equipment in items that wouldn't draw suspicion: purses, hat boxes, hollowed-out books. Reverend Tillman leveraged his extensive church connections to identify potential field operatives in cities across the South and Midwest. Looking for people with specific characteristics, they needed to be unknown to local Klan leadership, capable of maintaining cover stories under pressure, skilled at observation and memory retention, and willing to accept that if they were discovered, rescue would be impossible. Samuel Washington designed the communication system, establishing a network of intermediaries, trusted individuals who would pass messages without knowing their full content or context, creating a chain where breaking one link would not expose the whole. By January 1923, the network was operational with 37 people in active roles and another 53 serving as couriers, message drops, or safe houses. The first major intelligence breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Dorothy Sinclair was a cleaning woman who worked in the offices of a Klan-affiliated business in Atlanta, a printing company that produced the Klan's newspapers, membership materials, and promotional literature. Dorothy had been carefully vetted and recruited by Reverend Tillman's Atlanta contact, a woman named Grace Holloway, who ran a boarding house that served as the operation's regional hub. Dorothy's job gave her access to the building after hours, when executives left documents on desks, when filing cabinets were unlocked, when the day's trash had not yet been emptied. She had been trained by Adelaide Brooks in document photography, taught to work quickly and quietly, to return everything exactly as found, to never photograph the same document twice unless absolutely necessary. Over 6 months, Dorothy produced more than 400 photographs of internal Klan correspondence, financial records, membership lists, and planning. Documents for violence across 3 states. The intelligence was extraordinarily valuable, but it was also dangerous evidence to possess. The documents Dorothy photographed revealed an organization far more sophisticated than its public image suggested. The Klan operated through a complex corporate structure with clear hierarchies, defined territories, and accounting practices that tracked income from membership dues, sales of regalia, and what internal documents euphemistically called special assessments, extortion payments from black-owned businesses. The correspondence showed systematic coordination between Klan chapters across state lines, with violence in one location often planned to coincide with political events in another, creating patterns designed to maximize terror while minimizing federal attention. Perhaps most disturbing were the membership lists, which included not just names, but occupations, and those occupations included police officers, sheriffs, judges, elected officials, and in one case, a federal prosecutor. This was documentation of a conspiracy that reached into every level of government, evidence that the system itself was compromised. The question became what to do with such evidence, how to expose it without destroying the sources and methods that produced it. Samuel Washington argued for patience, for continuing to gather intelligence until they had documentation so comprehensive it could not be dismissed or compartmentalized. If we release partial information, he explained during a meeting in Pittsburgh, they'll claim these are isolated incidents, bad actors who don't represent the organization. We need to show the pattern, the system, the coordination. We need to prove this is not a few criminals wearing hoods, but an organized terror campaign with institutional support. Others disagreed, arguing that people were dying while they accumulated evidence, that every day they waited meant more funerals, more grieving families. The debate was agonizing because both positions were correct. They decided to continue intelligence gathering while simultaneously preparing a careful, limited disclosure, providing evidence of specific planned violence to black newspapers in cities where they had strong networks, allowing those communities to prepare defenses while not revealing the full scope of their intelligence operation. It was a compromise that satisfied no one but kept the mission intact. The operation expanded significantly in spring 1923, when they successfully placed their first operative inside Klan meetings. Ezra Coleman was a light-skinned black man who could pass for white, a veteran who had returned from France to find his printing business burned and his family run out of their Tennessee hometown. He had made his way to Chicago, where Samuel Washington recruited him for what Washington described as the most dangerous assignment any man can accept. Ezra understood immediately what was being asked, that he would attend Klan meetings, that he would witness planning of violence against people who looked like him, that he would do nothing to stop it in order to preserve his cover, and that discovery would mean a death too terrible to imagine. He accepted without hesitation. "They took everything from me," he said simply. "Let me take something from them." Jonathan Reeves spent 3 months preparing Ezra, teaching him how to construct and maintain a cover identity, how to answer probing questions, how to observe without appearing to observe, how to remember details without taking notes. Ezra's cover story was carefully crafted. He was a printing salesman from Indianapolis, recently moved to the Chicago area, interested in the Klan because he believed in preserving American values and wanted to connect with like-minded businessmen. Reeves arranged for him to be introduced to the Klan through business contacts, creating a paper trail that would withstand scrutiny. References from Indianapolis businessmen, actually Operation sympathizers, membership in civic organizations, even newspaper clippings about his business activities. Ezra attended his first Klan meeting in May 1923 in a meeting hall above a hardware store on Chicago's South Side. He sat in the back row, his heart hammering so hard he was certain everyone could hear it, surrounded by 200 men in civilian clothes, discussing voter suppression, housing segregation, and dealing with troublemakers in language that made their violent intentions clear. He committed everything to memory, names he heard, organizational structure, who seemed to hold real power versus who just talked loudly. When he left that first meeting, he walked 6 blocks before allowing himself to stop and breathe. The intelligence Ezra provided over the following months was invaluable precisely because it came from inside. He learned that Klan meetings followed a consistent structure: opening rituals, financial reports, committee updates, and what they called action planning. There was sometimes explicit violence, sometimes veiled in euphemism, but always clearly understood by everyone present. He discovered that the Klan operated through specialized committees, one focused on political influence, another on economic pressure against black businesses, another on what they openly called enforcement. He observed the casual way violence was discussed, how men talked about beatings and burnings, the way businessmen might discuss inventory management, with attention to logistics and timing, but no apparent moral consideration. He documented the complicity of law enforcement, listening to police officers describe how they would ensure no one was arrested after necessary actions, how they would lose paperwork or misfile evidence. Ezra passed this information to Samuel Washington through dead drops and coded messages, never meeting directly, never communicating in ways that could be traced. The psychological toll on operatives was something the mission's organizers had anticipated but not fully prepared for. Ezra Coleman attended Klan meetings where violence against black communities was planned, and he could not warn the intended victims without exposing himself. Adelaide Brooks developed photographs showing preparations for lynchings, images of smiling men posing with rope and rifles, and she could not share them without revealing how they were obtained. Dorothy Sinclair read correspondence casually discussing murder and terrorism as though describing weather patterns, correspondence she had to photograph and replace without anyone knowing she'd seen it. Each person carried knowledge that weighed on them differently. Some became withdrawn and haunted, others channeled it into focused rage, but none were unchanged by what they witnessed. Reverend Tillman organized monthly gatherings in different cities, ostensibly church meetings, but actually support sessions where operatives could speak honestly about the burden they carried, could cry or rage, or simply sit in silence with others who understood. The operation nearly collapsed in August 1923 when a courier named Thomas Wright was stopped by police in Birmingham while carrying encrypted messages between Atlanta and Memphis. The police had no reason to suspect the message's content, but Wright's nervousness during the stop, caused by knowing what he carried, led them to search him more thoroughly. They found the encrypted messages, which they could not read but recognized as suspicious. Wright was held for 2 days, while police attempted to determine what the encrypted text contained. The operation's compartmentalization protected it. Wright genuinely did not know what the messages said or who had sent them, knew only that he was to deliver them to a specific intermediary in Memphis. He maintained that the papers were business correspondence in a code he'd developed with an associate, a story weak enough to keep police interested, but not criminal enough to justify extended detention. He was eventually released, but the incident exposed a vulnerability. Police were now aware that some form of coded communication was occurring, even if they didn't understand its purpose. Samuel Washington convened an emergency meeting of the operations leadership in Cincinnati, bringing together the 7 people who understood the network's full scope. They debated whether to pause operations, whether to change their communication methods, whether to develop new protocols for couriers. Jonathan Reeves argued that changing procedures too dramatically would itself be suspicious, that if police were monitoring for patterns, sudden pattern changes would draw attention. They ultimately decided to continue operations, but with additional security layers. Multiple couriers would carry pieces of messages, which would only be meaningful when assembled together. Dead drops would be used more extensively, reducing direct handoffs, and they would establish what Reeves called legend building, creating innocuous reasons for operatives to be in contact, business relationships, or family connections that explained why they might communicate. These changes slowed intelligence flow but made the network more resilient. The incident also reinforced the crucial importance of compartmentalization. Because Wright knew so little, his detention compromised nothing beyond awareness that coded messages existed. The second major intelligence breakthrough came from Ezra Coleman's access to the Klan's financial records. In his role as a printing salesman, Ezra had carefully cultivated a relationship with the Klan's Chicago treasurer, a man named Harold Sutton, who owned a manufacturing business and enjoyed talking about his financial acumen. Sutton saw Ezra as a potential business contact and, more importantly, as someone who admired his organizational skills. Over months, Ezra encouraged this perception, asking Sutton's advice on business matters, expressing interest in how large organizations managed their finances. Eventually, Sutton began showing Ezra documents he was particularly proud of, ledgers that tracked Klan income and expenses with meticulous detail, organizational charts showing the hierarchy from local chapters up to national leadership, correspondence with chapters in other states regarding coordination of activities. Sutton never suspected that Ezra was memorizing everything he saw, that each conversation was the intelligence-gathering session, that the admiring questions were designed to elicit specific information. What Ezra learned was staggering in its implications. The Klan was not a loose confederation of independent chapters, but a sophisticated organization with centralized financial control and strategic planning. National leadership collected a percentage of all membership dues, creating a substantial revenue stream that funded coordination activities, propaganda production, and what ledgers carefully described as operational support, money that was distributed to local chapters for specific projects, with those chapters submitting detailed expense reports after completion. The financial record showed that violence was not spontaneous or locally motivated, but often funded and directed from above, part of coordinated campaigns designed to achieve strategic objectives. Even more damning, the records showed payments to law enforcement officers, judges, and government officials, not listed as bribes, but as consultation fees or security services. This was evidence of systematic corruption, proof that the Klan's impunity was not just social, but purchased through an organized system of payments to people charged with enforcing the law. Ezra understood that this information was potentially the most important intelligence the operation had gathered, but extracting it posed enormous challenges. The financial records were kept in Sutton's office and home, never left unattended, and were far too extensive to memorize completely. Ezra would need to photograph them, which required access, equipment, and time, all enormously risky. He developed a plan that would take weeks to execute. He told Sutton he was considering a major business expansion and wanted to study how the Klan organized its finances as a model for structuring a larger operation. Sutton, flattered, agreed to let Ezra review the records in detail, though always under Sutton's supervision. Ezra began visiting Sutton's office regularly, spending hours studying ledgers and organizational documents. During these sessions, he used a miniature camera Adelaide Brooks had provided, a device small enough to conceal in his pocket with a shutter so quiet it was nearly silent. Over 3 weeks, Ezra photographed more than 200 pages of financial records, working slowly, and the intelligence network expanded through 1923 and into 1924, growing more sophisticated as operatives learned from experience. They developed signals and codes for different types of information, allowing rapid communication of urgent intelligence. They created multiple levels of backup. Crucial documents were photographed, negatives were duplicated, copies were stored in different cities, some were even sent to trusted contacts in Canada and Mexico, creating a distributed archive that would survive even if American authorities attempted to suppress evidence. They recruited new operatives carefully, always through personal connections, always with extensive vetting. By mid-1924, the network included more than 70 active intelligence gatherers, over 100 support personnel, and safe. Houses in 14 states. The operation had evolved from an ambitious idea discussed in a church basement into a functioning intelligence network that would have impressed military planners. The human cost of the operation grew alongside its sophistication. 2 operatives were beaten severely after being identified at events where they shouldn't have been. Their cover stories held, but suspicion was enough for violence. 3 safe houses were compromised, requiring rapid evacuation and loss of valuable resources. Dorothy Sinclair in Atlanta had a terrifying encounter when she was nearly discovered photographing documents, saved only by her quick thinking in staging a fall that scattered papers everywhere, allowing her to reshuffle them while making it look like she was cleaning up an accident. Ezra Coleman lived with daily terror that his true identity would be discovered, knowing that exposure meant not just death, but torture designed to extract information about the broader network. Every operative understood they were expendable, that the mission's survival mattered more than any individual's safety. This knowledge created a strange kind of peace. Having already accepted the worst possibility, they could focus entirely on their work without the paralysis that comes from fear of consequences. The intelligence they gathered painted a detailed picture of the Klan's operations across multiple states. They documented the organization's involvement in electoral politics, showing how Klan members coordinated to influence primary elections in both parties, ensuring that viable candidates were either Klan members or sympathetic to Klan positions. They traced the Klan's economic warfare against black communities, documenting systematic campaigns to deny black businesses access to credit, to organize boycotts, to pressure white business owners who traded with black customers. They recorded the Klan's infiltration of Protestant denominations, showing how Klan ideology was being preached from pulpits and integrated into Sunday school curricula. They mapped the organization's structure with precision, identifying not just local leaders, but the national hierarchy that directed operations. And most crucially, they gathered overwhelming evidence of the Klan's connection to violence. Not just individual acts of terrorism, but organized campaigns of murder and intimidation, planned with military precision and protected by corrupt law enforcement. The question of what to do with the accumulated intelligence created significant debate within the operation's leadership. They had gathered evidence that could potentially destroy the Klan's claim to legitimacy, that could expose its criminal nature and the complicity of officials who protected it. But how to release this information without endangering operatives still in place, without giving the Klan time to destroy evidence, without allowing sympathetic authorities to suppress revelations. Reverend Tillman advocated for delivering everything to the federal government, believing that the sheer weight of evidence would force intervention. Samuel Washington was skeptical, pointing out that they had documented federal officials on Klan membership lists, that trusting any government agency was dangerous. Adelaide Brooks suggested a media strategy, providing evidence simultaneously to multiple newspapers in different regions, making suppression impossible. Jonathan Reeves proposed a hybrid approach, carefully releasing some intelligence while holding back crucial information that could continue to damage the Klan over time. The decision was made for them by external events. In September 1924, Ezra Coleman attended a Klan meeting where a special action was announced, a coordinated campaign of violence across 5 cities, timed to occur simultaneously in late October, designed to suppress black voter turnout before the November elections. The scale of what was being planned was unprecedented in Ezra's experience. Multiple lynchings, church burnings, attacks on black businesses, all coordinated to create maximum terror. Ezra got word to Samuel Washington that same night, breaking protocol to deliver an urgent message. They had to act immediately. There was no time for debate about perfect strategies or ideal circumstances. They had intelligence that could save lives, and withholding it to protect Operational security meant choosing the mission over people. "We didn't build this network to protect the network," Reverend Tillman said when Washington convened an emergency leadership meeting. "We built it to protect our people. If we let this happen because we're afraid of exposure, we become complicit in our own oppression." The operation launched its disclosure in October 1924 with careful coordination. They had compiled a comprehensive dossier of evidence, photographs of documents, financial records, membership lists, meeting minutes, planning documents for violence, proof of law enforcement complicity. This dossier was duplicated and delivered simultaneously to 14 different newspapers, including major black newspapers like the Chicago Defender and Pittsburgh Courier, but also several white-owned papers with histories of investigative journalism. Accompanying the evidence was a detailed explanation of how it was gathered, testimony from operatives willing to go public, and analysis showing patterns of coordination and institutional support. They also delivered copies to select federal officials, ones they had researched carefully, who were not on Klan membership lists, who had records suggesting they might act on such evidence. The disclosure was designed to be too large to suppress, too well documented to dismiss, too distributed to contain. By making everything public simultaneously, they hoped to force action before the planned October violence could occur. The response was immediate and overwhelming, though not uniformly positive. Several newspapers published detailed exposés based on the intelligence, with the Chicago Defender running a week-long series that laid out the Klan's organizational structure, financial operations, and connections to violence with damning clarity. These publications sparked national attention and outrage, particularly in black communities that saw their long-standing claims about organized terrorism finally supported by documented evidence. But the backlash was equally swift and severe. Klan sympathizers in the media attacked the credibility of the evidence, claiming it was fabricated by radicals seeking to undermine a legitimate fraternal organization. Some newspapers that had initially planned to publish the material were pressured by advertisers and local officials to hold or minimize the stories. In several cities, the black newspapers that ran the exposés saw their offices vandalized, their printing presses damaged, their journalists threatened. The intelligence network's operatives faced immediate danger. Dorothy Sinclair in Atlanta had to flee when someone, likely someone inside the printing company where she worked, realized that the leaked documents matched ones from the company's files. She made it to Grace Holloway's boarding house, which served as a safe house, just hours before Klan members arrived looking for her. Grace had already evacuated everyone and arranged for Dorothy to be smuggled to Cincinnati on a freight train, hidden among cargo. Ezra Coleman's situation was even more precarious. He was still attending Klan meetings when the exposés began running, still pretending to be a loyal member, while knowing the organization now realized it had been infiltrated. Harold Sutton, the treasurer whose records Ezra had photographed, became obsessed with identifying who had betrayed him, conducting an internal investigation that included interrogating members Sutton considered suspicious. Ezra had to maintain his cover while watching Sutton's net close around him, knowing that one wrong word or nervous gesture could prove fatal. The federal response was disappointingly limited. While some officials publicly expressed concern about the evidence of Klan violence and corruption, actual prosecutions were rare and targeted only the most egregious cases where evidence was overwhelming, and ignoring it would be politically untenable. Many federal prosecutors in southern states simply declined to act, and several judges who were themselves Klan members or sympathizers dismissed cases on technical grounds. The intelligence network had naively hoped that presenting evidence would force the justice system to act, but they had underestimated how deeply the Klan had embedded itself in that system. It was a painful lesson about the difference between exposing wrongdoing and achieving accountability, between documenting crimes and securing convictions. Yet even this limited response represented progress. For the first time, Klan members faced actual consequences for violence, even if those consequences were disproportionately light compared to their crimes. The most significant impact of the intelligence disclosure was not legal, but social and political. The evidence fundamentally altered public discourse about the Klan, making it impossible for the organization to maintain its image as simply a patriotic fraternal order. The financial records showing payments to officials, the meeting minutes discussing violence in bureaucratic language, the membership lists revealing how deeply the Klan had infiltrated government, all of this created a narrative that mainstream media could not ignore. The Klan was forced onto the defensive, issuing denials and attacking the credibility of the intelligence, but those denials were undermined by the specificity and volume of evidence. Politicians who had previously courted Klan support began distancing themselves from the organization, recognizing that association with documented terrorism carried political costs. Some religious denominations that had tolerated or supported the Klan began reconsidering that relationship, with several issuing statements condemning the violence the intelligence revealed. The intelligence operation also had profound effects within black communities. For decades, black Americans had known about Klan violence, had warned about its organized nature, had insisted that law enforcement was complicit, but had been dismissed as exaggerating, as misunderstanding isolated incidents, as being oversensitive to social friction. The documented evidence from the intelligence operation validated what black communities had always known, providing proof that their testimonies were accurate, that their fears were justified, that the system was indeed corrupted by organized white supremacy. This validation mattered enormously, shifting discussions from whether racial terrorism existed to what would be done about it. The operation also demonstrated black agency and capability in ways that challenged prevailing stereotypes. This was not a story of passive victims waiting for salvation, but of sophisticated resistance, of people building complex intelligence networks, of strategic thinking and tactical execution at the highest level. The operation's success inspired similar efforts in other regions. Using the disclosed intelligence network as a model, communities in Virginia, Louisiana, and Texas began developing their own surveillance and documentation projects targeting Klan activities in their areas. These efforts operated independently but learned from the original network's experiences, adopting its security protocols, communication methods, and intelligence gathering techniques. By 1926, there were at least 7 such operations across the South and Midwest, creating a distributed system of surveillance that the Klan found increasingly difficult to evade. The Klan responded by tightening its security, becoming more secretive, conducting counterintelligence operations to identify infiltrators. But this increased paranoia had the effect of making the organization less effective, as members became suspicious of each other, as activities that once happened openly now required elaborate security measures, as the organization spent more resources protecting itself than attacking communities. The personal costs of the operation were devastating for many operatives. Ezra Coleman was forced to flee Chicago in December 1924 when Harold Sutton's investigation finally identified him as a likely source of the leaked financial records. Ezra's carefully constructed cover identity unraveled when someone noticed discrepancies in his business background. The Indianapolis references that seemed legitimate but collapsed under sustained scrutiny. Ezra had perhaps 24 hours warning before the Klan would have moved against him. He abandoned everything except a small bag of essentials and photographs of his deceased family, leaving on an overnight train to Detroit, where Samuel Washington had arranged safe passage to Canada. Ezra would spend the rest of his life in Toronto, never able to return to the United States, cut off from family members he'd left behind, living under an assumed name. He rarely spoke about his time inside the Klan, but friends who knew him in Canada noted he never slept through the night, that certain sounds or phrases would make him freeze and become distant. Dorothy Sinclair's evacuation from Atlanta marked the end of her previous life. The woman who had been a cleaning woman with a quiet routine became a fugitive who had to abandon her home, her community, her identity. The network moved her through several cities, Cincinnati, then Cleveland, finally settling her in Harlem, where she could disappear into the anonymity of a large black community. She found work as a seamstress and tried to rebuild some semblance of normal life. But the trauma of what she'd witnessed in those documents, combined with the constant fear during her time photographing them, had marked her permanently. Adelaide Brooks visited her in 1926 and found a woman who barely resembled the determined operative she'd trained. Dorothy had developed severe anxiety, jumping at unexpected sounds, unable to sleep without light, plagued by nightmares of being discovered. "I would do it again," Dorothy told Adelaide during that visit, her hands trembling even as she spoke with conviction. "Every photograph was worth it, but I can't pretend it didn't break something in me that I don't think will heal." The network itself gradually wound down after the major disclosure in 1924. Some operatives continued, intelligence gathering on a smaller scale, but the heightened Klan security measures made further infiltration extremely difficult and dangerous. The operations leadership made the decision to preserve what remained of the network, rather than risk more operatives in increasingly risky operations. They shifted focus to analyzing and disseminating the intelligence already gathered, working with journalists and researchers to ensure the evidence would be understood and used effectively. Samuel Washington spent years after the operation's active phase ended working with black newspapers to publish detailed analyses of specific aspects of the intelligence, keeping the revelations alive in public discourse. Reverend Tillman used the evidence in speaking tours across the North, showing audiences documentation of the Klan's operations and arguing for federal anti-lynching legislation. Adelaide Brooks trained a new generation of documentary photographers, teaching them not just technical skills, but the ethical responsibilities that came with documenting injustice. The long-term impact of the intelligence operation is difficult to measure precisely, but was undeniably significant. The operation had exposed the Klan's organized nature and institutional connections at the height of the organization's power, creating a documentary record that historians and activists would reference for decades. The evidence gathered contributed to declining Klan membership. Through the late 1920s, as the organization's image shifted from patriotic fraternal order to documented terrorist organization, some of the financial evidence was used in tax investigations that resulted in prosecutions of Klan leaders for financial crimes. Authorities who wouldn't prosecute violence could sometimes be motivated to act on tax evasion. The intelligence network's existence also influenced Klan behavior, making the organization more paranoid and cautious, less likely to document its activities, which ironically made it less efficiently organized. Every meeting could have an infiltrator, every document could be photographed, every conversation could be reported. The operation also established methodologies and models that influenced later civil rights intelligence gathering. The careful compartmentalization, the use of dead drops and coded communications, the emphasis on documentation rather than just testimony, the creation of distributed archives, all of these techniques would be employed by civil rights organizations in the 1950s and 1960s. When SNCC and other organizations documented violence during the Freedom Summer of 1964, they were using methods pioneered by operatives like Dorothy Sinclair 40 years earlier. When civil rights lawyers built cases against Southern officials for constitutional violations, they relied on evidence-gathering techniques refined during the operation Reverend Tillman initiated in that Pittsburgh church basement. The operation demonstrated that resistance to organized white supremacy required not just courage, but systematic intelligence, not just protest, but documentation, not just testimony, but proof that could not be dismissed. Perhaps most importantly, the operation preserved evidence that would otherwise have been lost. The Klan's own records from this period were largely destroyed. As the organization's legal troubles mounted in later decades, leaders systematically eliminated documentation that could be used against them. Without the intelligence gathered by the operation, historians would have had to rely primarily on Klan propaganda and black testimony, which was often dismissed as biased or exaggerated. The operation's archives provided independent, contemporaneous documentation of Klan activities from the organization's own records, creating an evidentiary foundation that made denial impossible. When scholars in later decades sought to understand the Second Klan's operations, they relied heavily on intelligence the operation had preserved. The photographs Dorothy Sinclair risked her life to take, the financial records Ezra Coleman meticulously documented, the correspondence and meeting minutes gathered by dozens of operatives, all of this became part of the historical record, ensuring that this period of American history could not be whitewashed or forgotten. The individuals who conducted this operation have largely been forgotten by mainstream history, their names unknown to most Americans, their contributions unacknowledged in standard historical accounts. This erasure is itself revealing. American historical memory has struggled to incorporate stories that challenge simplistic narratives of black passivity and white agency, that show sophisticated resistance rather than just suffering, that demonstrate black Americans building complex organizations rather than just responding to white initiatives. The intelligence network represented exactly the kind of black agency that dominant historical narratives have systematically minimized, and so its operatives remain obscure despite the extraordinary nature of their accomplishments. Reverend Marcus Tillman died in 1947 in Pittsburgh. His journal and papers eventually donated to a small historical society where they gathered dust for decades before a researcher discovered them in the 1980s. Samuel Washington lived until 1963, long enough to see the civil rights movement employ some of the tactics he had pioneered, but he never publicly discussed his role in the intelligence operation. Adelaide Brooks became a significant figure in the Harlem Renaissance photography movement, known for her portraits of black artists and intellectuals, but few people knew about her earlier work, documenting Klan evidence or training covert operatives. She destroyed most of her intelligence-related materials in the 1950s, during the McCarthy era, fearing they would be misinterpreted as evidence of radical activities. Only a small cache of photographs survived, discovered among her effects after her death in 1971, images that stunned researchers with their historical significance. Klan planning meetings, documents showing payments to officials, preparations for violence, all photographed at tremendous personal risk. Dorothy Sinclair lived quietly in Harlem until her death in 1958, never speaking publicly. About her intelligence work, the trauma of what she'd experienced locked inside her until the end. Ezra Coleman lived to be 93, dying in Toronto in 1987, a man who had given up everything to expose America's most dangerous terrorist organization, but whose sacrifice was known to virtually no one. The intelligence operation's legacy lives on, not in public memory, but in the documentary evidence it preserved and the methodologies it developed. Every historian who writes about the Second Klan's structure and operations, every researcher who analyzes the organization's financial systems or political connections, every scholar who examines law enforcement complicity with racial terrorism, all of them rely on evidence that operatives risked and sometimes gave their lives to gather. The operation demonstrated that resistance takes many forms, that courage manifests not just in public confrontation, but in patient, dangerous intelligence work, that exposing evil requires not just recognizing it, but documenting it with systematic rigor. The operatives understood that fighting white supremacy required understanding it, that effective resistance demanded intelligence about enemies' organization, resources, and plans. They built a network that embodied these principles and produced results that damaged the Klan more effectively than many more visible forms of resistance. The intelligence operation also revealed uncomfortable truths about American institutions in the 1920s. The evidence gathered documented not just Klan violence, but the systematic complicity of law enforcement, elected officials, judges, and other authority figures. This complicity was not incidental or coincidental, but organized and financially motivated. Officials were paid to look the other way, to lose evidence, to decline prosecutions, to actively protect Klan members from consequences. The intelligence showed that white supremacist terrorism operated not despite American institutions, but through them, not against the law, but with the law's protection. This reality was devastating to confront because it meant that appeals to authority were often useless or counterproductive, that the system itself was corrupted beyond the possibility of internal reform. The operatives recognized this truth and adjusted their strategies accordingly. They built their own intelligence capability because they could not trust official investigations. They created their own archives because they could not rely on official records. They developed their own networks because they could not depend on official protection. This institutional complicity also explained why the intelligence operations disclosures produced limited legal consequences. Exposing Klan crimes meant exposing the officials who protected those crimes, and those officials were often in positions to prevent or limit prosecutions. The system protected itself by protecting the Klan, and challenging the Klan meant challenging the system, a fight that required resources and power the operation did not possess. Yet the exposure itself had value even without legal consequences, making complicity visible, documenting the corruption, creating a record that could not be denied. These outcomes mattered enormously even when they didn't produce immediate justice. The operatives understood they were building evidence not just for contemporary use, but for history, creating a documentary record that would eventually make denial impossible, even if it couldn't immediately force accountability. They were playing a longer game, fighting not just for justice in their moment, but for historical truth that would outlast them. The operation also illustrated the particular vulnerability and courage of black women in resistance movements. Adelaide Brooks, Dorothy Sinclair, Grace Holloway, who ran the Atlanta Safe House, the dozens of other women who served as couriers, photographers, safe house operators, and intelligence analysts, all faced unique dangers because of their gender combined with their race. They could be targeted for violence with even greater impunity than black men. Their testimony was given even less credibility by authorities. Their movements were constrained by social expectations that made certain activities or presences immediately suspicious. Yet, they were also sometimes able to operate with less suspicion precisely because prevailing assumptions about black women's capabilities meant they were not seen as potential threats. Dorothy Sinclair was a cleaning woman, a role so socially invisible that she could work among sensitive documents without anyone imagining she might systematically photograph them. Adelaide Brooks was a photographer, but her gender meant few people imagined she was training covert operatives rather than just taking portraits. These women exploited the underestimation that came with their intersectional marginalization, turning society's blindness to their capabilities into an operational advantage. The secret mission that exposed the KKK's darkest operations represents a largely forgotten chapter in the history of resistance to white supremacist terrorism. While mainstream American historical memory emphasizes legal challenges, political movements, and prominent leaders, the intelligence operation showed a different kind of resistance. Patient, methodical, covert, and extraordinarily dangerous. The operatives who built this network were not waiting for salvation from external authorities, but creating their own capability to understand and expose their enemies. They recognized that effective resistance required intelligence, that defeating the Klan meant documenting its operations with the same rigor the Klan used to plan violence. They built an organization that matched their opponent's sophistication while operating under far more dangerous conditions, with far fewer resources, and without the institutional protection the Klan enjoyed. The operation's success can be measured in multiple ways. The immediate impact included media exposure that damaged the Klan's reputation, evidence used in some prosecutions, and intelligence that allowed communities to prepare for planned violence. The longer-term impact included contributing to declining Klan membership through the late 1920s, establishing methodologies used by later civil rights organizations, and preserving documentary evidence that became invaluable to historians. But perhaps the most profound impact was demonstrating black agency and capability in ways that challenged every stereotype of black passivity or dependence. The operatives who built and ran this intelligence network were sophisticated strategists, skilled technicians, disciplined professionals who planned and executed complex operations under extraordinarily difficult conditions. They were not victims waiting for rescue, but agents actively fighting for their community's survival and freedom. The story of this secret mission matters not just as history, but as a counter-narrative to dominant stories about civil rights struggle that often minimize black agency and strategic thinking. It matters as evidence that resistance to white supremacy has always included not just public protest, but covert intelligence operations, not just legal challenges, but systematic documentation of crimes the legal system refused to prosecute. It matters as a reminder that fighting injustice requires understanding the systems that perpetuate injustice, that effective resistance demands intelligence about enemies' organization and operations, and it matters as recognition of the courage required not just to stand publicly against oppression, but to operate in shadows, gathering evidence, to live with knowledge that could get you killed, to maintain cover, identities while witnessing atrocities, to sacrifice normalcy and safety for a mission larger than yourself. The operatives who conducted this mission gave up comfort, security, and in some cases their very identities to expose the Klan's darkest operations. Their names may be largely forgotten, but their legacy lives on in every researcher who uses the evidence they gathered, in every methodology they pioneered, in every community that learned from their example that resistance requires not just courage, but organized intelligence, systematic documentation, and strategic thinking that matches or exceeds your enemy's capabilities.